Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasrinavati Tamastu Ma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good morning. So our topic today is not as scheduled. The topic was to be a new day, and it's going to be a very new day. It's a new lecture and a new topic. So Swami Atmavidyananda went to a memorial service. So our topic today is the variety of Ramakrishna's disciples. And I think it's a good time to just sort of step back and summarize and look at the variety of the various disciples. It's close to Guru Purnima, and these were all, of course, the original gurus of our order. So from that standpoint, it's a nice time to do this as well. Our song listed a few of the other disciples that we're not going to cover. We're just going to look at the male monastic disciples. We're not going to be talking about the householder disciples or Holy Mother or several of the women disciples. But you'll see that we're going to run out of time even just to do this small task. But the reason this is so wonderful is that we're living close enough to this incarnation that we have access to relatively accurate historical biographies of these people. And so it gives us a bigger variety to look at examples of how spiritual people behave and how they came to spiritual life. And many times I think if you only have one example or two examples, or there are examples that are so old in the historical past that they've sort of become mythologized into these kind of unapproachable beings on pedestals, that it's important to see that spiritual life is possible for people of all varieties. And sometimes we need examples of people that have different temperaments, different qualities, different strengths, and different weaknesses. So we're going to take a little bit of time to look at that today. When I first started this lecture, I thought I would find some examples of where they had different teachings for different people, and I used the book What the Disciples Said About It, which was compiled by our devotee up in Santa Barbara, Nalini, or Edith Tipple. She did a marvelous job of collecting all of the different sayings. Now, the one drawback about this is that some of the disciples didn't have a lot of recorded teachings. They didn't write books, and they didn't somehow leave a lot of memoirs with people. So we have a lot less on some than we do on others. And then, of course, we have people like Vivekananda and Vedanta who have volumes and volumes of teachings, and she couldn't possibly have sorted through all of those. So we just get a little bits and pieces of their teachings. But still, it's an interesting resource to sort of compare how the different disciples approach a particular topic. And there are hundreds of topics, or at least a couple hundred topics. And so I sort of narrowed it down to the ones that seem to have the most material on them. And I was surprised that there are actually very few times when they give very different kinds of advice. That after you read it, you say, oh, I bet all these people had the same spiritual teacher, because they tended to use the same kinds of examples and so forth. And yet each one gives it their own little flavor, and each one you'll see might have a lot on one topic and not so much to say about some other topic, depending on their particular temperament. But there were a few examples that we can see where you find a very different statement. For example, Ramakrishna Nanda said regarding science, the whole scientific method is based on observation and experiment. But the moment man realizes that there is something beyond observation and experiment, he will give them up and leave material science behind. Science will always have to deal with finite bodies, and God is infinite. The scientific method is the ordinary method. For science, as we have seen, is based on observation and observation and experiment are based on the senses. Therefore, science cannot go beyond limited beings, but God and truth are limitless. But then Swami Ramananda said concerning Bose's experiments showing the sensitivities of plants to stimuli, there was a time when Thakur could not step on the grass, but would jump from one bare spot to another to avoid hurting the grass. At that time, we simply didn't believe that grass could be sensitive. From what I saw today, I realize how infallibly true his perceptions were. Don't give up your science. You will get everything through this. So, very opposite kind of opinions there. Here's another couple that show some different approaches. Swami Turiyananda says, reliance on one's apparent self leads to ruin. To presume to be the all-knowing is extremely harmful. Self-reliance or self-confidence means faith in the higher self. To persist in remaining what one already is, or in holding on to one's preconceived opinions at any cost, such self-importance is bad. To stand on one's own legs means to rely on that I which comprehends the cosmic I, not on the I which thinks that it is so-and-so and has passed so many examinations. To stand on this is of no use. Swami Ramakrishna Nanda says, but that's a very thorough explanation, so you get kind of the balance between the different opinions there. But in another place, you might see a quote from Ramakrishna Nanda that says, depend entirely upon yourself. Heaven helps those who help themselves. And Swami Saradananda, depend upon God and stand on your own feet. So you see, this is one of those topics that you can kind of go back and forth, and you have to be careful on how you're analyzing it. Swami Atmavidyananda, dependence on God is true self-reliance. So you see, if you look at the idea of self-reliance in the correct light, he says that really is dependence on God. Self-confidence, self-reliance are of primary importance. Then comes spiritual attainment. The Master used to say one's chosen deity is one's own self. And Swami Premananda, learn to believe in yourself, consider yourself to be a divine child, and think that bad qualities such as selfishness will never manifest themselves in you. So you see, you get a variety of opinions. And so that's the value of the book, is that you can get the whole range. Any one little piece taken out of context and you might get the wrong opinion. But if you read through the whole section, then you're going to find the balance, and you're going to find the one that speaks to you, the approach that speaks to you. And then we have a couple on sleep. Swami Ramananda, a true celibate can do the work of 25 men, practice continence, japam, and meditation, and seek the company of the holy. He no longer requires so much sleep. 4 or 5 hours are plenty. More sleep is a disease. Swami Shivananda, why should a monk sleep too much at night? A little sleep for 1 or 2 hours should be enough. When he practices japa and meditation, when will he practice japa and meditation if he spends the whole night in sleep? And then in another place, Swami Shivananda says, no, don't do that. Have sufficient sleep, and then meditate as much as you can without strain. And Swami Premananda says, it is necessary to be regular about sleep. So, again, you get differences of opinion, and this may very well be dependent on who they're talking to and knowing what their tendencies are and what their capabilities are. Okay, and then one last example, Swami Shivananda. Just as every work has its purpose and time, you should also have an appointed time for calling on God. At that time, you should think of God and commune with Him, even though you may have 100 or more things to attend to. And then Swami Akhandananda says, is there a fixed time and place for taking the name of God? Throw away the clocks, break them. They are a kind of obstacle. It is from the sun that we get the idea of time. Think of a state where there is no sun. And of course, he's going to want you to think of God all the time. So you see, you can get some interesting varieties. All right, so now we're going to go through some slides. If we can get this up here. Let's see, is that going to come up? Speak to us. How do we get this to go on? Oh, there we go. All right. All right. So we're going to summarize first a few of the things about the direct disciples. We get bits and pieces of these things from various lectures. We especially we might hear the Swamis talk about them as their birthdays come around in the year. But what we find is that although there's quite a cluster of them that was born in the 1860s, if you look at the whole batch of direct disciples, you find that they were born from 1828 to 1868. So that's a spread of 40 years. And they lived to be anywhere from 38 years old, dying very young, to 81 years old, dying at a very old age. There were at least 2 of the disciples that came from extremely poor families, and 5 that came from relatively wealthy families. They spanned the spectrum from being completely uneducated to being brilliant scholars. They ranged from being soft, sweet-natured, to being strong and hot-tempered. Some of them had fragile bodies, some of them had very strong and vigorous bodies. There were at least 5 members of the Brahmo Samaj and 2 others that were influenced by the Brahmo Samaj, which was a sort of a Hindu reform movement that was quite popular at this particular time. Some were very, very orthodox, and others were looking at more liberal approaches to religion. Some came to Sri Ramakrishna due to great grief or out of some other great problem. Some came just out of curiosity, and others out of a deep spiritual yearning, looking for a teacher. 2 had apparently been with Christ in a previous incarnation, and 2 had been with Chaitanya. 1 had been a companion of Lord Krishna, 1 was an ancient rishi, 1 was a great yogi, and 4 had been previously married before they came to Sri Ramakrishna. So we have a couple of charts just to summarize a couple of those things. Why isn't this going? Come on, do something. There we go. Just move it along this way. All right, I'm not sure this is going to be big enough for you to see, but this is a chart of their lifespans. So the yellow lines are the various lifespans. So you can just get a general idea that there was quite a cluster of people being born in the 60s, the 1860s, but you have a couple that were born quite a bit earlier. Ramakrishna is the very top one. And then Vivekananda is the one that was born even before he was. And then you can see that, again, that some of them lived very short lives, some of them lived relatively long lives. Why won't this just play here? Just doesn't want to do it. All right, did it before. All right, and this is the period of contact they had with Sri Ramakrishna. So this started in, the first blue line is Yogananda in 78. So that gives you a sense of where those dates are. And of course, the last line would be 1886 when Sri Ramakrishna passed away. So you see some of them had a relatively short period of time. These are by quarters, so you get 4 little bars for each year. And some of them met Sri Ramakrishna, were around for a while, then they had to go away for some reason, then they came back. So you see a couple of holes there. So this gives you, again, a sense that some of them had a very long association with Sri Ramakrishna, and some of them a relatively short time with Sri Ramakrishna. All right, so we see that the members of the Brahma Samaj were Vivekananda, Brahmananda, and Shivananda, and the others that were either familiar with it or somehow influenced by it were Advaitananda, Saradananda, Ramakrishna Nanda, and Subodhananda. Sometimes you get the impression that practically all of them came from the Brahma Samaj, but that's not accurate. Okay, there are several that were said to be Ishwar Kotis. Vivekananda, Brahmananda, Premananda, Niranjanananda, Yogananda, and then the householder disciple Purna. Those were said to be ever-free souls by Sri Ramakrishna. But there are also some hints about Shivananda and Adbhutananda, which if we have time, I'll go into that. But there's kind of a hint that perhaps there's some aspect of an ever-free soul for those two as well, even though they're not usually listed that way. And the 4 that had been married previously were Brahmananda, Advaitananda, Yogananda, and Shivananda. Ramakrishna Nanda had a previous incarnation with Christ. Saradananda was with both Christ and Chaitanya, and Premananda was with Chaitanya. And it is said that he was a part of Radha. He had some aspects of Radha in him. And Brahmananda is, of course, said to have been with Krishna. Vivekananda was one of the 7 rishis. Yogananda was said to have been Arjuna. Niranjan was a partial incarnation of Rama. So those are some other interesting little sidelights of these different direct disciples in their previous incarnations. All right, so Vivekananda, of course, is often thought of as sort of the chief disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, the one who brought his message to the entire world. And since we've had a lot of lectures on Swami Vivekananda, I'm not going to say a lot about him today. We're going to spend most of our time with some of the ones we don't hear quite as much about. But of course, he was the one who founded the order and sort of banded the group together, laid down the foundations and the rules of the order. But he died fairly soon after the order was established, spent a couple of those years, the early years, in the West, so he wasn't even in India for the first couple of years. So most of the running of the order was done by Swami Brahmananda. So Swami Brahmananda, of course, is known as the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna said that he could rule a kingdom, and that's why he was dubbed Raja or Maharaj, because he could rule a kingdom. And of course, the kingdom he ended up ruling was the spiritual kingdom of the Ramakrishna order. He was taken by his brother-in-law, Manomohan Mitra, to Sri Ramakrishna. His father was a wealthy landlord in the salt and mustard seed trade, and his mother was very devoted to Krishna. So obviously, if you're going to reincarnate and you have been with Krishna, you would pick a family that has somebody in it that's devoted to Krishna. He was said to his general nature was very practical. He had a lot of common sense. He was very sweet and had a very loving nature. And he had the spiritual power to evaluate people's abilities, which made him an excellent choice for the first president of the order, and assigning people different tasks to do, putting just the right person in just the right position. Sri Ramakrishna said that he belonged to the realm of the personal God. Ramakrishna told Narendra, that would be Vivekananda, not to intimidate Swami Ramananda, who was then known as Rockall. I'll probably stick to their monastic name so that I don't have to keep switching back and forth. Otherwise it gets a little bit tedious. Anyway, so he told him not to intimidate him about worshiping God with form. Rockall acted just like Ramakrishna's child. At one point, he had a spiritual experience of seeing a girl from 7 or 8 years of age enter into Sri Ramakrishna's body. He was taught Kundalini Yoga from Sri Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna said that Rockall could rule a kingdom. He also loved sports, he loved gardening, he loved fishing, he loved devotional singing. He was an excellent student, and he practiced meditation from an early age. So again, if you know a little background about these people, sometimes you think, oh, that's somebody I can relate to. You see, because I'm interested in some of those things too. He was married to the sister of Manomohan Mitra, and he was the first president of the order until he passed away in 1922. In the interim period between the passing away of Sri Ramakrishna and the formal founding of the order, he went on many pilgrimages. When you look at his teachings, as summarized in the book, What the Disciples Said About It, you find that his favorite topics were meditation, the mind, and work. And he also had more to say than some of the others on things such as food and the nature of divine grace. All right, so Swami Atmavidyananda, also known as Latu Maharaj, his name means that which is wonderful. We're not too sure about his birth date, but probably in the late 50s, 1850s, and he died at 1920. So we're not exactly sure how old he was when he died. But he had gotten a job as a servant in the house of Ramchandra Datta, who was a great devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. And so it was through that contact that he came to Sri Ramakrishna. He was originally born in a remote village of Bihar and orphaned at a tender age. And he was brought to Calcutta by his uncle, where he got him this job with Ramchandra Datta. On one of the visits, Ramakrishna had expressed a need for an attendant, and so Latu started living with him and serving him. And of course, he had to get permission to leave his service with Ramchandra Datta, but fortunately, being the great devotee that he was, he allowed Latu to leave his service and go to Sri Ramakrishna. And he's the one that was usually mentioned as being completely unschooled. He just didn't have any education, didn't even make it through the alphabet. For him, the guru was all in all, and his service was exceptionally devoted. Many people, though, that had contact with him recorded his sayings and teachings, which we read through in our Friday night class. And you find that he said quite a bit about the value of holy company and the nature of death. So he was a very interesting person, and I would encourage you to read his life and teachings, because it's really quite inspiring to see his different approach to things. Advaita, he was the oldest of the group, even older than Sri Ramakrishna. His name, of course, means in the bliss of non-dualism. And he saw Sri Ramakrishna at a fairly early time at a Brahmo festival, probably in the late 1870s. But it wasn't until his wife died and he was in a state of extreme grief that someone took him to Sri Ramakrishna to help him get over his grief. And that wasn't until 1884. So here we have one of those incidences where there was a very early contact, but not an intimate contact until a little later. But some interesting sidelights. His father worked for Benny Paul, who had invited Ramakrishna to his garden house for these Brahmo celebrations. So that's how he happened to be at these Brahmo celebrations where Sri Ramakrishna was attending. He was admired, and you don't hear much about him because he didn't leave a book of teachings. There aren't any reminiscences of him, so forth. So you don't get a whole lot of information. So the only place to get more information is Swami Chaitananda's book on the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. So, but he was admired for his managerial capacity, his sweet nature, and his personal cleanliness, his neatness, his very methodical way of doing things. So his experience as a householder and someone who had been out in the workplace and had to manage a job came in very handy in the early monastery. They had somebody that knew how to run things, and they used those skills. Those skills were used. He was somebody who played the tabla, and he was one of the first to come to the Baranagar Mat. Swami Premananda. Swami Premananda's name, of course, means in the bliss of ecstatic love. His sister was married to Balaram Bose. The principal of his school was Mahendranath Gupta, and his classmate was Rakal. And it was Rakal who took him to Sri Ramakrishna. He also came from a very well-to-do family, and his mother was a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna already. And it was at his family home in Antapur on that Christmas Eve where we hear the story of how the direct disciples decided to renounce the world and become a group of monks. His innate nature was said to be very pure, and he was one of the very few people that Ramakrishna could have touch him when he was in a very high spiritual state. The touch of other people was something he couldn't tolerate, but Premananda was so pure that he was the one that ended up having to attend him when he was in his highest states. So Sri Ramakrishna asked Babaram's mother, that's Premananda's mother, for her son to come live and attend to his services in 1884. In return, she was granted two boons, that she would have unflinching devotion for God and that none of her children would die before her. Swami Premananda had the nature of a very feminine nature, very sweet, very loving. He was said to be like a clean pot in which milk can be stored without the fear of it souring. Ramakrishna said that Balaram had been born as a part of Rata, and he called him a companion of his soul. But early reports of his childhood said that he'd actually been kind of a naughty little boy, but he knew that his spiritual goal in life, what his spiritual goal in life was, and that he sought a guru to teach him. And with his mother being a devotee, that he didn't have to go very far. He also, of course, went to the school where M taught. But he failed the entrance exam to college so that he could go and serve Sri Ramakrishna instead. In the interim period when the order had been founded, but there was no Belar Mat yet, he went on many pilgrimages as well, to Puri, Varanasi, Vrindavan, many of the typical holy pilgrimage spots. After the formal founding of the order, he looked after the management of Belar Mat and took charge of the new monks as they started to join. And he did that from 1902 to 1916. In addition, he had the task of doing the daily puja. We always forget somebody had to be doing the puja every day at all of these different centers. But he was one of the ones that had a rather fragile, frail body. And just as his name would imply, you find that he had a lot to say about the nature of love. But he also had a lot to say about the nature of work, as somebody who's managing a monastery would have to have. But you also find that he said quite a bit about things like action, anger, bondage, desire, devotion, ego, fear, love, peace, prayer. We have a lot of teachings of Swami Premananda, and so we have some nice resource material. Again, I would encourage you to find these individual books or Edith Tippel's compilations. Niranjanananda. Niranjanananda means one who has no spot of guilt. Now he has an interesting background, very different kind of a background from some of the others. He went with his spiritualist friends to see Sri Ramakrishna. And they thought it might be kind of fun to see what kind of readings they would get, or whether they could channel something interesting with Sri Ramakrishna. But of course, Sri Ramakrishna could read right through everything they were thinking and doing, and they weren't able to get anywhere with him. And so later he said to Niranjanananda, if you dwell on ghosts, you will become a ghost. Dwell on God and you will be filled with God. He was one that had somewhat of a violent temper, but he is said to have been very handsome and strong and a very big person. He was fearless and heroic, and he did have clairvoyant powers, and he was known to be able to do psychic healings. But when he came to Sri Ramakrishna, of course, this tendencies all kind of went into the background. He too went on many pilgrimages to holy spots, and he served Sri Ramakrishna day and night during his final illnesses. He was also instrumental in bringing the ashes to Bellarmine, and he inspired a group in Varanasi who eventually founded the Ramakrishna Mission Home of Service. When touched by Sri Ramakrishna on one of his early meetings, he did continuous japam for 3 days with no sleep. It's another one we don't have a lot of teachings on, so you're not going to find quotes from him in these books. Got these out of order, sorry. All right, so our next one is Swami Yogananda, whose name literally means in the bliss of yoga, and he met Sri Ramakrishna when he was about 20. His family knew of Sri Ramakrishna, but disapproved of Sri Ramakrishna. And he came from one of the rather poor families. It was a Brahmin family, a very orthodox family, but they had fallen on hard times, and so it was a very poor family. He's another one that had a very gentle nature, but also a very independent nature. His life was very unobtrusive from all outward appearances, but very deep in the inner mystical experiences, of which he only gave a hint or two. One rather famous quote is that he asked Sri Ramakrishna how to conquer lust. And Ramakrishna told him to chant the name of Hari, and then it would go away. It's reported that when he was a little boy, playing with his playmates, he would suddenly lose interest and become introspective. He would rather be reading the Puranas and engaging in kirtan than playing with the other village kids. He was the one that attended on Holy Mother for quite some time, and he would sometimes disagree with Swami Vivekananda's policies, but would eventually come around to his way of thinking. But he was independent of spirit. Swami Saradananda, he came with his cousin who later became Ramakrishna Nanda. So Ramakrishna Nanda and Saradananda came right at the same time. And it's interesting that they had both been disciples of Christ. So here you have two cousins that were disciples of Christ coming to Sri Ramakrishna at the same time. Sardananda was highly intelligent, courageous, and had an interminable calm about him. You just couldn't shake him. You couldn't make him upset about things. Now, while in ecstasy, Sri Ramakrishna's behavior would often become mysterious. One day, in such a mood, he sat on the lap of this young Sardananda and remarked, "I was testing how much weight he could bear." And this is said to have foreshadowed the fact that he would be the first secretary of the Ramakrishna Mountain Mission. He was adept at giving service to the sick, both by temperament and experience. He had actually gone to medical college until he dropped out to serve Sri Ramakrishna during his final illness. He came to the United States and Europe from 1896 to 1898 and was briefly head of the Vedanta Society of New York. But he's best known as being the secretary of the Ramakrishna Mountain Mission and the director of the Udbodhan House and the sort of the gatekeeper, you could say, when Holy Mother was in Calcutta at the Udbodhan House. But the Udbodhan House was also the source of the publication house of the order at that time. So that work was also overseen by him, and he worked on the Great Master, which was the monumental volume of the life of Sri Ramakrishna, which has been more recently retranslated by Swami Chaitanyananda. Again, his favorite topics were meditation and work. You find all these people in charge of the order seem to meditation and work. You kind of know where their mind is here. Ramakrishna Nanda. He's the one we're currently reading in our Friday night reading circles. His father was a court pundit and well versed in tantric scriptures, and his father taught him many rituals and worship ceremonies. And so he was known for this. He was known for being very adept at formal worship, and he's the one that sort of designed the worship that we use today in the Ramakrishna order. He was very motherly towards his brother monks, and he was well versed in a variety of scriptures, including not only Hindu scriptures, but Christian scriptures and Sufi mystical poets. And he loved all sorts of subjects. He loved astronomy and math. He was an excellent Sanskrit student, but he also was very good at English literature. And so he's got a wide variety of disciplines that he was interested in. He's also known for being the one who attended the shrine without a break. He did not go on any pilgrimages, and he was the one who did the daily devotional worship of Sri Ramakrishna's relics at the early monasteries. And it wasn't until he was sent to found the Math in Madras that particular practice ended and was turned over to someone else. An interesting side note is that he tutored Keshav Sen's sons. This is sort of an interesting little side note. And his favorite topics were the nature of the ego, the mind, and spiritual realization. Shivananda was one who also became president of the Ramakrishna order and for a fairly long time after Swami Ramananda passed away. He had a fairly long term of service. And he was a little older than some of the others, even though he lived longer. He was a little older, so he lived to be 80 years old. But he was about 10 years older than most of those, the other group of young men that came about. His father was a legal advisor to Rani Rashmani, so that's how he ended up having some early contact with Sri Ramakrishna. His father had met Sri Ramakrishna in the 1950s, about the time when Shivananda was being born. Shivananda himself didn't meet him until around 1880 at the home of Ramchandra Datta. Ramchandra Datta worked for the same firm that his father worked for. So that's how the connection came about. Also a fairly wealthy family. And interestingly enough, the husband and wife, the parents of Swami Shivananda prayed to the Lord Shiva for a son for a whole year. And then finally the mother had a dream that Shiva told her that they would have a spiritual son. Unfortunately, the mother passed away when he was 9, so she didn't get to see the wonderful person that he was to become. Now, when Sri Ramakrishna first met the future Shivananda, he blessed him with a great spiritual experience. And Swami Shivananda said of that experience, "I realized at that time that I was the Atman, eternal and free. Ramakrishna was the Lord, born as man, for the good of humanity, and that I was on earth to serve him. He later described himself as Ramakrishna's dog." He quit after the 10th grade in order to go to work to help support the family, but he also was one of the ones that went on many pilgrimages. He also had somewhat of a nursing temperament, you could say, and he would be the one that tended to nurse the other monks when they would fall sick. And he was known for doing a lot of the household duties around in the early monastery. And he founded the center in Varanasi in 1902. He also established a free nursery school, and he became president in 1922. And at that time, the order significantly expanded around the world. That's when many of the centers in the West were founded. He sent many people to head the various centers in the United States. He had quite a bit to say about the householder and the nature of the mind. Swami Turiyananda, another one who came to the West. We had quite a few that we were so lucky that so many of these people came to the West. I should have had a chart on that. Okay, Swami Turiyananda. Turiya refers to the fourth state of consciousness, transcendental consciousness. And at the age of 14, he met Sri Ramakrishna for the first time, but just as a sort of casual meeting at a neighbor's house. The second time was 3 years later in 1880. He had the Brahman ideal of orthodoxy and asceticism. He bathed 3 times a day, recited the whole of the Gita, slept on the floor, and ate simple food. He's another one who asked Sri Ramakrishna how to control lust, and he was told to redirect that lust towards God. Now, he was fascinated by any kind of religious book. So while he was very orthodox, he was certainly not narrow. He went to a Christian missionary school, so he would have certainly had a lot of background there as well. He went on many pilgrimages, and he came to the United States because Swami Vivekananda wanted the West to see an ideal Indian sannyasin. So he founded Shanti Ashram near San Jose. Has anybody been to, how many have been to Shanti Ashram? A few of you? Yeah. I've never been, but I've heard it's a wonderful place to go. They open it up once a year in May, correct? All right. April. Last week of April. Yeah. So we're always having our annual meeting then, so can't get away. Vivekananda, another one who came to the West and served in San Francisco. There's page 1. Come on, page 1. Aha. I've given this lecture a couple times and I still haven't figured out how to get these papers in the right order. There are too many of them. He was another one who was a student of M, and this sounds like such a trivial thing, but he was came from a wealthy family, and he had lost a gold watch, and he became so distraught over the loss of this gold watch that he did poorly on the entrance exam. So M, observing this behavior, thought that perhaps he should go see Sri Ramakrishna, and so he took him to see Sri Ramakrishna. The parents believed that this son was born to them by the grace of the Mother Durga. They were a very wealthy land-owning family, and they overindulged him as a child, and he became accustomed to being waited on. So he was kind of a spoiled child, you could say. And of course, Sri Ramakrishna can see everyone's tendencies, and so he would immediately ask him to do different menial tasks to begin his education of spiritual service. And some of his friends who knew him sort of got a good chuckle out of seeing him have to learn how to do some menial tasks. An astrologer predicted that he would be a great yogi and a man of wisdom. He had a great memory and could chant the Gita, the Chandi, and the Upanishads. He organized the relief work during the famine of 1897 and was the head of the San Francisco Center from 1902 to 1915. And he built the old temple, which is just being renovated, and it's going to be dedicated on Kali Puja, right? Up there in San Francisco. So that was originally built by, well, supervised by him, the building of it. But unfortunately, he was killed by a bomb thrown by a mentally ill student. He didn't die right away, but he died of the injuries that he got from that bomb blast. But again, a very interesting life, a very different kind of life. Subodhananda. Again, you don't hear too much about him. And I think sometimes the sort of one-line descriptions of him, like we got in the song, how did he put it? Where did it go? Oh, hail childlike, simple Subodh. You kind of get the picture of someone that's kind of uneducated and just kind of always giggling and not really very competent at anything. And that's really completely inaccurate. I mean, he did have a very sweet and childlike nature. And so if you just met him, you would think, oh, isn't this a sweet little kind of childlike person? But he was actually a very competent person. He had the fortune that his mother and father were both great devotees of Ramakrishna, and they gave him a book of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. He had a very childlike and sympathetic nature and had the ability to cheer people up, and he loved tea. So that was one of the famous things that people like to remember about him. When Sri Ramakrishna met him, he said, "You will attain the goal. Mother says so." And he wrote on his tongue, saying, "Mother, awake." Subodh felt the whole body trembling and a current rushing up his spinal column to the brain. So he was a wonderful combination of compassion, love, and childlike simplicity, but a profound spiritual wisdom. He actively associated with many of the relief works of the Ramakrishna mission. And there's a funny story about how Swami Vivekananda, wanted all the monks to be able to speak and to speak well on any topic and so forth. So he finally pushed Subodhananda into getting up to give a talk. And just as he got up, there was an earthquake, the earthquake of 1897. And he got out of giving his speech. And so, of course, they all joked about how earth-shaking his speech was. But he actually served as the treasurer of the Ramakrishna Mission. He was a good mathematician and a good accountant, and he served in that capacity. And when you hear some of these descriptions, you don't picture someone like that also being very good at disciplined, detailed office kind of work. But he had a very good mind for that as well. So you don't let his little simple childlike nature fool you. Okay, we're out of time, so we'll just rush through the last couple of these. Couple of highlights about each of these. Akhandananda, he led the famine relief in 1897 and started an orphanage and industrial school in Sargachi, and he was the third president from 1934 to 37. We often hear about how Turiyananda had a carbuncle removed without anesthesia. Well, Akhandananda also had an abscess removed at the age of 8. He had an abscess removed without anesthesia. Another interesting side note was that he was in an amateur theater party with Girish's son. They were friends, and they had an amateur drama troupe together with some other friends, of course. Now, we've heard a little bit more about Vivekananda because the former head of the center, Swami Swananda, was, of course, a disciple of Swami Vivekananda, so we've heard a little bit more about him. And he was unusual in that he was not able to join the order right away. He had to provide for his mother. His engineering degree, I mean, many of these young men just dropped out of school and went to serve Sri Ramakrishna and so forth. But he had a different path. He had to finish his education, got a very good engineering job, earned enough money to make an endowment fund to take care of his mother, and then he joined the order. So he supervised the building of the Bellarmont campus, designed the temple with Vivekananda, and of course it didn't get built for many years after Vivekananda passed away, but he fortunately lived quite a long life and was still alive when it was dedicated in 1938, which was the year he passed away. So looks like he just lasted long enough to see the project done. He was, again, the president from 1937 to 38. Okay, then just briefly, Abhedananda. Sri Ramakrishna said, "You are one of the most intelligent of the boys. You were a great yogi in your previous birth. This is your last birth. I am going to initiate you into the practice of yoga." And he was a precocious scholar. And if you've ever looked at his complete works, they fill an entire shelf. He was the head of the New York Center from 1897 to 1921, and also spent some time in London, traveled around and lectured very widely. And people that heard him and Vivekananda said there was nobody else that could match Abhedananda's lecturing except Vivekananda. So he was second to Vivekananda in his ability to capture an audience's attention and have that spiritual presence in the way he delivered things. All right, so I didn't get to Pramashananda's little writing, but anyway, there was a passage in Go Forward where Pramashananda describes Ramakrishna Loka, and he sort of gives all these sort of one-liners about what each of these people doing. Abhedananda's giving lectures, and Akhandananda's out serving the orphans, and Saradananda's looking after the guests, and so forth. So it's a very interesting little highlight about the nature of each of these different disciples. And so I think that among all of those disciples, and as I mentioned, we didn't even touch the householder disciples and the women disciples, but you can get something to relate to each one of this. It's something that they liked or some tendency that they had, so you can relate to them and see that you see spiritual progress is possible for people with all sorts of personalities and tendencies. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see, filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Peace, peace.